This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and we're today talking with Deep Singh. He's the executive director of the Jakara movement, which is a Central Valley nonprofit representing the interests of the Sikh community. So welcome to WorkWeek.
Thank you. Great to be on with you, Steve.
So Deep, there was a very important rally, Caravan, that was one of the largest in the history of California, of Sikh community, people throughout the community. What was that all about, and the significance of that for the Sikh community and the people of California and India?
Great to be on again with you, Steve. So what you're referring to is actually the Caravan that was started on December 5th. So it was sort of last month, where we had the opportunity to really invite Punjabi Sikhs and anyone that was caring about what was happening with the farmer and farm workers protests in India to join us in Oakland. We got an internal count from somebody that worked on the Bay Bridge that it was nearly 10,000 cars, and so we have no idea. We just know there was it was enough to stop the Bay Bridge on Saturday because so many thousands and thousands of people joined from all over California.
And that was to support the struggle of the Sikh community. What is happening in India with the Sikh farmers, and why this outpouring of support here in California from the Sikh community?
Absolutely. So specifically, the issue in some ways began emerging in late September of last year. What had happened was, as just like throughout the world, due to COVID-19, many of the sort of ways of how the parliament in India would normally function, things are a little bit different now. So the majoritarian party, which is called the BJP, which has very close links with fascist Hindutva groups, who are also very close with the former President Trump as well. So the Prime Minister and his Narendra Modi and his party really pushed through a set of draconian bills that were going to have an absolute long-term effect on the agricultural sort of economy in India, without allowing any even debate from opposition parties. And within the Indian Constitution, largely agriculture is left to the state. And so even state governments were never allowed to participate. He sort of rammed these three laws through, but those weren't the only ones. They also changed a lot of labor laws. So, although a very small percentage of the Indian work and labor community is in what we call the formal sector, but we're talking about changing from 8-hour workdays to 12-hour workdays. And so there were a lot of certain sort of long-term kind of economic and labor laws that were pushed through. And slowly the farmers began, specifically on the agricultural side, began organizing, going village to village, really just educating the average farmer about what are going to be the effects. Initially, the farmers were protesting the state government, asking to repeal these laws. And when they saw that in a federalist system in the way that India is, where all power is centralized in Delhi, that really there's no scope for them for the state governments to do anything. So beginning in late November, in what was the largest general strike in world history, in terms of the millions of people that struck in solidarity. And from that point on, the Punjabi farmers, but not exclusively, you had farmers from other parts of India, have set up encampments on the borders of New Delhi and are basically trying to raise the issue. And some of the farmer union leaders are in negotiation and talks with the BJP and the central government there.
And the Modi government has cracked down, is very repressive against students, against dissidents, and also it hasn't been following the policy of the United States as far as privatization, deregulation of the Indian economy. How has that affected the people of India?
So you've really seen the gutting of any provisions that were already lax and weak to begin with. But you're starting to see the utter destruction of them, specifically in the sector of agriculture, which is still the largest employer in India, even though if its percentage as the GDP has decreased. What you're seeing is large private equity firms, largely based in the United States, but as we know with global capitalists, capital is not based in any, and nor does it have any sort of loyalty to any particular domain. So private equity firms have started purchasing and trying to set up contract labor systems in India. And Modi has his billionaire sort of funders. And one of them, who's the richest man of India, his last name is Ambani, he has a major stakehold even in Facebook. So what they were trying to do in some ways is to peel out middlemen, but those middlemen also created certain sort of support, minimum price supports for agricultural labor. So they're trying to cut all that out, telling the farmer that if you go the free market route, you will get a higher price. But the farmers are too savvy. They said, yes, we'll get a higher price for a year or two, but with no government protections. We know by year 3 or 4, all of that will be lifted, taken away, and then the ravages of the so-called free market are left to fall upon us and our family.
And this strike that you're talking about, how did it take place? And there is now in mobilization, continuing mobilization in New Delhi. What happened after the strike? What effect did the strike have? And how is the struggle continuing now? And you had a recent action at the Indian consulate in San Francisco, and you wanted to show that there's continuing support for the struggle in the United States.
So what had occurred on November 26th was a general strike called by essentially almost all sectors of labor unions that were in opposition to the BJP government. And so that's why, and many of them, even if they do not represent people in the informal sector, those even in the informal sector know that they're still fighting for us in terms of, even if these laws are just on paper and don't always have an effect in terms of our real life, we still have something at stake. And hence why you had hundreds of millions. I mean, in the United States, that's unbelievable to think of, to put these kind of numbers into just into your mind. But over hundreds of millions that participated on November 26th. That was also the launch for the farmers to move their kind of group into Delhi. What has been subsequently to that, like I said, it's really seen as this neoliberal reforms that people understand will be essentially the giving up of India's own sovereignty. And all the Modi government has to show is really fascism and authoritarianism against its sort of minority communities. So on January 26th, which is India's Republic Day, there were processions at Indian consulates throughout the world. We helped organize one and participated in one in San Francisco, and we saw on January 26th a sort of new round of repression in India of the state against the farmers. A number of farmers have been killed. A number of even Indian journalists who have been reporting on the farmers have been abducted, kidnapped, and some of them, we assume they're in police custody because there are videos of them being kidnapped. But at this point, we haven't heard from them, and we've seen a big crackdown on Twitter by the Indian government. Actually, the Time magazine just put out an article talking about in real time how many Twitter accounts that were supporting the farmers have all been taken down because the Indian government has called for them to be censored.
And you say they're Indian capitals who've invested in Twitter as well. So Twitter and Facebook are being used politically to suppress any kind of information about these struggles of the farmers in India.
Absolutely. I think here in the United States, when we're having these conversations, specifically with regards to the account of former President Trump, oftentimes we think these conversations are about Democrat or Republican or right or left. mostly these conversations actually have to do with the effects on capital. That's if you really want a kind of a more stronger analysis, you have to look at it from that lens, not in terms of just Democrat, Republican.
And we're talking with Deepa Singh. He's with the Jakarta movement from Central Valley. And let's talk about what has been going on in the Central Valley, because I know we've covered the struggle for health and safety and to protect workers at foster farms and other factories. I mean, the Central Valley is a factory, factories of food processing and meat, all kinds of food processing. And it has well been hit by the COVID pandemic. Why don't you talk about the effect of the COVID pandemic in the Central Valley, how it's affected workers and particularly the Sikh community?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So, you know, again, like many of us always share, COVID-19 did not make new problems come about. They exacerbated existing problems that we know have always been there. What we have, unfortunately, and especially in even in California, which sometimes people don't assume the case is, we have very weak regulation in terms of our labor laws, whether that be from Cal-OSHA, the DOJ, systems that we assume would make workplaces safe. There is neither the stomach to enforce that from the legislative bodies in Sacramento, nor Governor Newsom in the executive. So what often happens, you have a lot of paper tigers, but you don't actually see the effect of that. So specifically, we've been raising the case of poultry and meat factory workers who we know from a UC San Francisco study that just came out a few weeks ago that by far across the nation, but also in California, have been the center of spread. It has been because it is a perfect storm in terms of what are the conditions in a meat and poultry plant, which are indoors, they're enclosed, people are working in very close proximity to one another. There's not very good ventilation in terms of space. So we know these are the conditions that make the spread of the virus worse. What we're learning in I believe an article that will be coming out in the near future is that the number of deaths in California that Cal-OSHA has tied to employment is very, very small. And that's because we do not have very good transparency and even data collection. So I have talked to a number of families who have lost a loved one oftentimes and have asked them, has anybody even called you to even understand what were the work conditions that led to the death of your loved one? And oftentimes they say nobody has ever collected that information. And so across the state, across the country, while we may have an aggregate number of deaths, in terms of really understanding what was the malfeasance by oftentimes their employer, that we don't, that data has not unfortunately been put together, and really horrible conditions still languish, you know, for many meat, poultry and other food processing employers across the state.
And the last time I talked to you was with the death of 12, 13 workers at the Foster Farms factory. I know the Board of Supervisors in Merced County were against having any kind of mask. They represent the corporations that do business there. And OSHA has really not been inspecting the facilities. There are less than 200 OSHA inspectors for 18 million workers in California. There are more fish and game inspectors than OSHA inspectors. You have tried to get support and protection for the community. What's happened with that? What does Governor Newsom say and the legislators in the Central Valley that you've contacted?
You know, it's rather unfortunate that you know, despite Governor Newsom having a specific rhetoric in terms around, you know, how much he cares about workers, we have seen very, very little in enforcement in terms of what that actually looks like at the shop floor. And we're just trying to raise as much noise as possible. We're hoping with a new administration in DC that has some trickle down effects in terms of what becomes the culture, allowing for sort of worker rights and other types of provisions. but the question you're asking me right now, Steve, the situation is still grim. We're still talking to workers who get sick, get infected at their employment site, and then within 5-10 days, their employer is constantly threatening them to have to return. We're talking about large corporations like Foster Farms that do not provide masks for their workers. It's on the workers themselves to have to provide this each and every day. And we're also starting to see a kind of a funny thing in terms of how numbers are conducted, where even though we do not know specifically how an employee may have gotten the contracted COVID, what employers are doing is saying, oh, maybe they got it through carpooling, and disaggregating the data of carpooling with getting the virus at the employer site. And so hence artificially depressing the numbers of those that are being infected across the state.
And maybe you can talk about your organization, Jakara, and what you're doing and how people can get in touch with you. And also the fact that many of the workers in the Sikh community don't speak English. Are they being given information at the factories that they understand what the dangers are and are protected?
The bigger question around language access, although in California there's a lot of rhetoric around it, when it actually comes down, I was on a hearing with regards to EDD in terms of what sort of language access provisions they make. Unfortunately, it's still very, very at an early stage, very mediocre in terms of language provisions, let alone for the Punjabi language, which is still one of the top 12 most spoken languages in the state. Even in terms of some of more widely spoken languages like Korean, Vietnamese, the sort of ecosystem that's supposed to provide for that is really extremely lacking. To your question, do people get information? It's nothing consistent. More often than not, they're reliant on a coworker that may speak English to help them. And this makes it sort of, when you have a situation where people cannot directly communicate, it becomes rife for opportunities for people to spread rumors, to give false information. And to be frank, that happens in every community.
And how can people get more information about your organization and get support for the Sikh community, as well as all the other workers in the Central Valley who are struggling to survive in the midst of the worst pandemic in 100 years?
So, the Jakara movement has been around for 20 years. We work in 15 counties across California, especially throughout the Central Valley, from Kern up to Sutter County, and across to the Bay and Alameda and Santa Clara counties. Please, if you're looking to get in touch with us, or even a lot of our partner organizations that work in all parts of the Central Valley and other parts of the state, we'd love to be a resource to connect with you. You can find us at www.jakara.org. That's JAKARA.org. It's not the Jakarta city of Indonesia, just JAKARA. Or you can find us on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, you name it, at Jakara Movement. But if you could heed my advice, get off Facebook if you can.
And the history of the Sikhs, of radical Indians who came to the United States and also fought for the independence of India. That tradition continues. Is that a part of the tradition of Jakara, the fight for the working people and the farmers in not just here, but in India?
I love it, Steve. You're well read, my friend. So yes, we are very much sort of inspired by the Ghadar Party. And what was fantastic about the Ghadar Party was really it was people that took part with the Wobblies. Their first meetings were oftentimes in Finnish socialist institutes. They worked with Filipinos. They worked with those from Mexico. They worked with the Irish. Anyone that was really sort of excluded in the early part of the 20th century. And some of those most radical histories, radical labor histories, are actually here in California. People don't know about, in 1933, the cotton strikes which are still the largest farming strikes in American history that happened in the 1930s here in the Central Valley of California. So we are definitely motivated, inspired by those Gadaris, as the revolutionaries, as we call them, Kartar Singh Sraba, Son Singh Pakran, so many more. And so we're very much in this struggle to build solidarity, to build partnerships, to build community, and really kind of create a new California.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us on Work Week. And your struggle is the struggle of all people, not just of California, but people around the world, working people, common people who are fighting for justice and fighting to survive in the midst of this terrible, catastrophic pandemic. So we're happy we could talk to you today on Work Week.
Thank you so much, Steve. Have a great one.